He thought he had everything: power, money, control, but all it took was one letter. And a boy in worn-out sneakers standing in his lobby to bring his perfect world crashing down. Kevin Barton, a cold and reclusive millionaire, is forced to face a truth buried in the past. A woman he once loved is dying, and the child she sends may be his son. As secrets unravel and trust is tested, what begins as a reluctant encounter turns into a journey of redemption, love, and second chances. Stay with us. This is a story that proves sometimes the smallest footsteps can lead to the biggest transformations. Before we begin, tell us, what would you do if the past knocked on your door, wearing a backpack and holding a letter? Kevin Barton's morning had unfolded with the precision of a chessboard he alone controlled, meetings stacked back to back, numbers projected, decisions made before others had time to blink. He had just left a conference room on the 39th floor when his assistant's voice crackled through the intercom, a hint of something unusual in her tone. "Mr. Barton," she said, "there's a boy downstairs asking for you. He says it's urgent." Kevin paused mid-step, his mind immediately dismissing it as a publicity stunt or perhaps a security issue. But then she added, "He's carrying a letter with your name on it, handwritten. He insists it's only for you." Against his own instinct to ignore disruptions, Kevin felt a small, inexplicable tug of curiosity he hadn't indulged in years. By the time he reached the elevator and descended, he had rehearsed the curt words he would use to send the boy away. Yet when the doors opened to the ground floor, the scene waiting for him disarmed every prepared response. A small boy stood at the edge of the marble reception area, sneakers scuffed, hair a little too long, clutching a crumpled envelope against his chest like it was the last safe thing in the world. The boy's eyes found Kevin before Kevin even spoke. They were steady and solemn, but not frightened, and that steadiness caught him off guard more than any outburst could have. Kevin opened his mouth to demand an explanation, but the boy beat him to it. "Are you Mr. Barton?" His voice was soft, deliberate, like someone repeating instructions from memory. Kevin blinked. "Yes. And you are?" "Lucas," the boy said, gripping the envelope tighter. "My mom told me to give this to you. She said it's really, really important." Kevin's assistant hovered a few feet away, clearly unsure whether to intervene, but Kevin lifted a hand to stop her. Something about the boy's composure, no parent in sight, no tears, pressed against a part of Kevin he thought had long atrophied. "Where is your mother?" he asked. Lucas lowered his eyes briefly. She couldn't come. She said you'd understand if you read the letter." The words were too rehearsed to be casual, too heavy for a child. Kevin gestured toward a seating area, motioning for Lucas to sit. "Let me see the letter," he said, but Lucas shook his head slightly. "You have to promise to read it right now," he said quietly. "Not later. She said you might throw it away if you wait." Kevin's brows knit, irritation and curiosity tangling in equal measure. "I don't usually take instructions from 7-year-olds, he said, attempting dry humor, but the boy didn't flinch or smile. Instead, Lucas straightened his shoulders like a tiny soldier. "She said you wouldn't like it. But she also said you're smart enough to listen when it matters." Kevin exhaled slowly. The assistant shifted awkwardly, sensing a conversation she shouldn't overhear, and retreated toward the reception desk. "All right," Kevin said finally, extending his hand. "Give me the letter." Lucas stood but didn't immediately move. "You really have to read it now," he repeated, eyes still fixed on Kevin's. "She's sick. She said time is running out." Something in that last sentence, delivered so plainly without drama, landed like a punch. Kevin reached out and gently took the envelope, the paper warm and slightly damp from the boy's grip. He glanced at the handwriting on the front, neat but trembling. His name spelled out in full as only one person used to write it: Rachel Cromwell. The sight of the letters alone cracked open a memory of soft laughter and long drives, of a name he had buried beneath 8 years of work and silence. "Where did you come from, Lucas?" Kevin asked, his voice quieter now. The boy perched on the edge of the sofa, his feet not reaching the floor. "From home," he said simply. "I took the bus. Mom wrote down the stops for me." Kevin's head jerked up. "You took the bus here? Alone?" Lucas nodded once, eyes steady. "She said I could do it. She said I'm brave." Kevin studied him for a long moment, then ran a hand over his face, trying to marshal his thoughts. "You're 7? Almost 8, Lucas corrected softly. Kevin felt a ripple of something he couldn't name. This was not a lost child crying for his mother. This was a boy on a mission, sent with a task no child should have to carry. Kevin lowered himself into the seat opposite him. "Do you know what's in this letter?" he asked. Lucas hesitated, then shrugged. "A little. Mom said it would explain everything. She said you might not believe her, but you'll see when you look at me." The words hung between them, heavy and strange. Kevin found himself staring at the boy's face, his eyes, the shape of his mouth, and for a fleeting second, he saw something familiar staring back. Lucas broke the silence first. "She said you were important," he murmured, fiddling with a loose thread on his sleeve. "She said you used to make her laugh." Kevin's throat tightened unexpectedly. He hadn't thought of Rachel laughing in years. The last memories were of arguments, accusations, a breakup engineered with evidence he now realized he had never questioned deeply enough. "She said a lot, huh?" Kevin managed. Lucas looked up at him. "She said you might be my dad." The words were delivered without hesitation, without hope, like a fact already known but waiting to be confirmed. Kevin felt the room tilt. He opened his mouth, closed it again. "Lucas," he began, but the boy cut him off gently. "You don't have to say anything yet. Just read it, please." Kevin rubbed his thumb along the edge of the envelope, the faint scent of Rachel's old perfume rising from it. 8 years had passed since he last saw her. 8 years since the night that had ended with slammed doors and silence. And now here was this boy, solemn and direct, asking him to read a letter that might change everything he believed about himself. Kevin leaned back, the envelope heavy in his hands, his mind racing. He could send the boy away. He could call security or send an assistant to deal with it. He could pretend this never happened, as he had done with so many disruptions before. But looking at Lucas's small hands folded tightly, jaw set with the kind of courage only desperation can teach, he knew he couldn't. He tore open the letter carefully, aware of the boy's watchful gaze. The first lines blurred as his eyes scanned them, recognizing Rachel's voice even in ink. She spoke of their past, of a son born after their last night together, of doctors and mistakes, and time slipping away. "Our son needs you now," the letter said. "I have nowhere else to turn." Kevin's hands trembled. He looked up and Lucas was still there, waiting as if he'd been waiting his whole life. In that instant, Kevin's meticulously ordered world built brick by brick to keep out unpredictability, and pain began to fracture. Kevin closed the door to his office with a quiet click, sealing himself off from the world outside. He stood for a moment with the envelope still in his hands, staring at it as if it had teeth. Then, without ceremony, he pulled the letter out, unfolded the slightly crumpled sheet, and let his eyes fall on the handwriting he could never forget. The strokes were uneven now, like someone trying to hold on to something that kept slipping. Lavender. That was the first thing that struck him, the faintest hint of the perfume Rachel used to wear. The scent rose from the paper, not in waves but in fragments, like a memory breaking open. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to read past the swelling in his throat. "Kevin, if you're reading this, it means Lucas found you. He's brave, like I knew he would be. I didn't want to send him, but I had no one else, and he deserves more than what I can give him now." Kevin sat down slowly, the paper trembling in his fingers. The words on the page weren't dramatic, they were honest, raw. "I never betrayed you. Not then, not ever. Lucas was born out of love, not revenge. I wanted to tell you for years, but I thought you wouldn't believe me. And maybe you won't now. But I had to try." It felt less like reading and more like bleeding in reverse. Rachel's voice poured from the page with such clarity that Kevin could almost hear her speaking it aloud. He didn't know how long he sat there, but at some point he realized he hadn't turned the page yet. His fingers were gripping the edges so tightly that the creases were beginning to split. He eased his grip and continued. "They said you couldn't have children. I believed them too. But Lucas is yours, Kevin. I know it without needing proof. You can see it if you just look. The way he sits, the way he thinks before he speaks. He's so much like you, it hurts sometimes." Kevin's eyes drifted from the letter toward the large window overlooking the city, but he wasn't seeing buildings anymore. He was seeing the way Lucas had stood in the lobby, calm, observant, unshaken, the same way Kevin had once been before everything collapsed. "I'm sick," Rachel's letter continued. "It's aggressive. We've tried everything. I don't have much time. Lucas doesn't know everything yet. I've protected him from the worst of it, but I can't protect him from what's coming. That's why he's with you now. He needs someone steady. Someone who won't vanish. Someone who might still remember what love feels like." Kevin pressed the paper against his chest for a moment before he could read further. Her words weren't a demand, they were an invitation, one he didn't feel worthy of answering. He looked up. Lucas was still there, sitting in the corner of the office on the leather bench, legs swinging, silent but alert. Kevin studied him now, not out of suspicion, but from the strange need to memorize every detail. The tilt of his head, the way his thumb absently brushed his palm. Kevin suddenly realized that Lucas was mirroring his own posture, back straight, ankles crossed, hands loosely folded. It wasn't perfect mimicry, it was subconscious, habitual, learned behavior, or inherited. Kevin cleared his throat. "How much did your mother tell you about me?" he asked gently. Lucas blinked. "Just that you were someone she used to love, and that you might not believe her." Kevin nodded slowly, feeling something tighten in his chest. "She told you I might be your father?" Lucas looked down. "She said maybe. But she also said you'd know if you just looked at me." That echoed the letter too closely to ignore. Kevin leaned back in his chair, the letter now resting on the desk like a wound he couldn't close. "Do you want something to drink?" he asked. Lucas shook his head. "I'm okay." Kevin hated how unchildlike that answer was. How composed he was for someone who had just been handed over to a stranger. "I'm going to have a test done," Kevin said after a long pause. "A DNA test. It's just something I have to do. Not because I don't believe your mother," he stopped himself, corrected. "Not because I don't believe Rachel, but because it's a lot. For both of us." Lucas nodded again, his expression unreadable. "She said you'd need proof. She said you always liked facts better than feelings." Kevin smiled faintly, despite the lump in his throat. She wasn't wrong. They sat in silence for a few moments. Not out of awkwardness, but because neither of them knew what the next right thing was. "Will you send me back if it's not true?" Lucas asked, not looking at him. Kevin froze. The question hit harder than he expected. "No," he said quietly. "You're here now. We'll figure things out, one step at a time." Lucas nodded again, but this time he looked directly at Kevin. There was something steady and searching in that gaze. Something that made Kevin's next breath catch. He didn't know the boy well enough to call it trust, but he also knew it wasn't doubt. It was something else, something waiting to be answered with action, not words. When the nurse from the private clinic arrived an hour later, Lucas didn't flinch as the cheek swab was taken. Kevin stood beside him, arms crossed but attentive, watching the process with a formality he couldn't drop. Lucas was quiet throughout, polite but distant, as if he had done this before, or expected to. After the nurse left with the samples, Kevin didn't say anything. He sat back down at his desk while Lucas returned to the bench without being told. The quiet stretched between them, but it wasn't cold. If anything, it was full of questions neither of them knew how to shape. Kevin stared at the letter again. There was still one line he hadn't allowed himself to absorb until now. "If you're reading this, it means I still trusted you, even after everything." It undid something in him. Rachel's handwriting wasn't just shaky, it was desperate, hopeful, honest in the way dying people are. Kevin rested his elbows on the desk and lowered his head into his hands. "You hungry?" he asked suddenly, not looking up. Lucas nodded. "A little." Kevin reached for the phone, about to call someone, but stopped. Instead, he stood. "Come on, let's get something ourselves." By the time they left the office together, Kevin still hadn't made sense of what he was feeling. The letter was tucked inside his jacket pocket, but its contents were rattling in his head like a song he didn't know the lyrics to. The DNA test had been done, that was the logical next step. The necessary precaution. But none of it had prepared him for the way Lucas walked beside him down the hallway. Just a few paces behind, but not afraid. Not clingy. Just there. Kevin glanced back once, and Lucas met his eyes with that same quiet, calm stare. It wasn't challenging, it was patient. As if the boy already knew what Kevin hadn't yet admitted to himself. Alone in his office, Kevin had read Rachel's letter, every word soaked in lavender ink and unspoken years. And now, though logic told him he needed proof, something deeper inside had already begun to unravel. Susan Osborne arrived at Kevin's office unannounced, as she often did when she sensed his attention was slipping somewhere she couldn't track. The elevator dinged, and the sharp click of her heels carried her across the reception floor like punctuation marks. She entered without knocking, catching sight first of Kevin at his desk, then of the small boy seated by the window. Her expression flickered for only a second, but Kevin caught it, the way surprise softened into calculation before she pulled her familiar smile into place. "I came to bring you lunch," she said lightly, holding up a sleek paper bag from the overpriced cafe she knew he liked. Her voice was smooth, practiced. "But I see you have company." Kevin didn't respond right away. Lucas didn't look up. He was folding a napkin, creasing it carefully into a triangle, then bending the edges inward. Susan walked in further, placing the bag on the edge of the desk as her eyes drifted back to the boy. "And who is this?" she asked, tone dipped in sweetness, but with the sharpness of someone assessing an unfamiliar threat. "His name is Lucas," Kevin said evenly. "He's Rachel's son. He didn't say more, didn't explain the letter or the test or the weight sitting between his ribs. Susan's smile faltered slightly, then recovered. Rachel, she echoed, like the name tasted sour, as in Rachel Cromwell. She turned her full attention to Kevin now, her voice lower. I thought that chapter was closed. Years ago. Kevin met her eyes, calm but unreadable. Apparently not. Susan's gaze shifted to Lucas again, her smile now gone entirely. And why is her son here, she asked. What does he want? Kevin opened a drawer slowly, not to take anything out, but to keep his hands busy. She sent him. She's sick. He didn't elaborate further, didn't offer the letter as evidence. Susan tilted her head. And what? She expects you to take him in? Just like that? She laughed, but there was no humor in it. Kevin, she accused you of things you never did. She vanished. And now she sends you a child? Her voice was rising, polished control slipping. You don't even know if he's yours. Kevin stood slowly. We're doing a test, he said, just to be sure. Susan's eyes narrowed. She knows you can't have children. We've known that for years. Are you really going to let her manipulate you again? Kevin didn't answer, but something in Susan's urgency felt off, as if she needed him to doubt, more than she needed to be right. Lucas, still by the window, hadn't moved. He was now adjusting the wings of his napkin plane, his fingers methodical, careful. He hadn't said a word since Susan arrived. Kevin's eyes drifted to him, and in that moment he saw something that unseated him. It wasn't the paper plane itself, it was the way Lucas stared out the glass as he folded it. Focused, but distant. Not trying to impress, just trying to escape. It was the same look Kevin had when he was a boy and locked himself in closets just to get a moment of silence from the chaos of his house. It wasn't just about distraction, it was survival. Kevin's chest tightened. Susan, he said, voice firmer now, I need a moment. Alone. Susan blinked, clearly taken aback. Kevin, come on. Don't let this story derail everything we've built. Kevin didn't waver. We'll talk later. She looked at Lucas again, and for the briefest second, her expression betrayed something closer to contempt than confusion. Then, just as quickly, she smoothed it back over. Of course, she said, turning to leave. You just take all the time you need. But there was venom in her voice now, hidden behind practiced elegance. As the door clicked shut behind her, the room felt different. Kevin let out a long breath, moving to sit beside Lucas instead of behind his desk. Lucas didn't speak, but handed him the paper plane without looking. Kevin turned it in his hands. The folds were imperfect but precise, the way a child builds something from memory rather than instruction. You like planes? Kevin asked. Lucas shrugged. They go far. It wasn't just an answer, it was a truth. Kevin held on to that for a moment. Do you make them a lot? Lucas nodded. When Mom's sleeping. Or when I don't want to think. Kevin smiled softly. Not because it was sweet, but because it was honest. Yeah, he said, I used to draw. For the same reason. Lucas looked up at him finally. Did you stop? Kevin hesitated. Yeah, I guess I did. Neither of them said anything for a while. The silence was no longer awkward, it was shared space. A quiet understanding. Kevin glanced toward the door where Susan had left, and for the first time in a long time, her absence felt less like a gap and more like relief. Something about Lucas's presence had made her seem out of place. Susan had always been composed, reliable, sharp, but now all Kevin could hear in her voice was resistance, not concern, not care, just urgency to regain control. And it wasn't about Lucas, not really. It was about what he represented. A disruption, a question mark. Proof that her version of the past might not be the only one that mattered. Kevin turned the plane in his hands again. You want to go get something to eat? He asked. Lucas glanced sideways. Didn't she bring you food? Kevin smiled. Not the kind I want anymore. Lucas grinned for the first time, barely, but it was real. Kevin stood and held out his hand. Lucas took it without hesitation. As they walked out of the office together, Kevin felt something shift again. It wasn't clarity, not yet, but it was movement. When Susan Osborne had arrived that afternoon, Kevin had expected comfort, familiarity. Instead, her presence had revealed a truth he hadn't seen clearly before. Lucas, sitting by the window, folding a napkin into a plane, wasn't just waiting, he was building a way out. And for the first time, Kevin realized he wanted to follow. Kevin stood outside the door longer than necessary, his knuckles hovering midair before finally knocking. He didn't know what he expected, a voice, footsteps, hesitation, but all that came was the sound of the latch turning, slowly. When the door opened, Rachel Cromwell stood behind it, thinner than he remembered, her hair tucked beneath a faded scarf, skin pale with exhaustion. But her eyes, those unmistakable eyes, met his without flinching. "You came," she said simply, her voice low but steady. Kevin nodded once, unsure whether to step forward or apologize. She leaned against the frame for support, not bothering to hide the tremor in her hand. "I wasn't sure you would." He tried to answer, but nothing came. The years between them stood heavier than her illness, thicker than the air in the hallway. Finally he spoke. "You should be resting." Rachel gave a tired smile. "Rest doesn't fix anything anymore." She stepped aside to let him in. The apartment was modest, clean, but lived in. He stepped through the doorway like a trespasser, careful not to disturb anything. There were no framed photos, no clutter, just functional simplicity. She closed the door behind him with slow fingers, and he noticed how even that small task left her breathless. They didn't hug. There were no apologies exchanged. Some silences are too old to be filled with words. Rachel gestured toward the small living room, but before either could sit, Lucas appeared from the hallway, holding a sock and a plastic dinosaur. "Hey," he said quietly, then looked between them like he'd interrupted something fragile. Rachel gave him a soft nod. "Lucas, why don't you show Kevin your room?" Kevin tensed at the sound of his own name in that sentence. It felt strange, foreign. But Lucas took the invitation without question. "Okay," he said, grabbing Kevin's hand without asking, leading him down the narrow hallway. The boy didn't speak until they reached the room. "This is it," he said, stepping aside like a tour guide showing an exhibit. Kevin looked around. Drawings lined the walls, held up with Scotch tape. Crayons sat in a neat row on the desk. A stack of worn books leaned against the lamp. The bed was too small and too tidy, the kind of neatness that doesn't come from being taught but from needing control. Kevin stepped closer to one of the drawings. A rocket ship surrounded by stars, a figure inside waving. "You drew this?" Lucas nodded. "When Mom was in the hospital, I wanted her to have something to come home to." Kevin knelt beside the desk, picking up a folded paper tucked next to the books. It was a chore list written in a child's scrawl. Dishes, feed Muffin, water plants, medicine at 6. "Muffin?" Kevin asked, glancing around. "Our neighbor's cat," Lucas said. "She lets me keep her here sometimes." Kevin said nothing, only stared at the list, then back at the perfectly made bed. "You take care of a lot around here," he said finally. Lucas shrugged. "Mom gets tired a lot." The way he said it wasn't resentful, it was matter of fact. Kevin felt something twist in his gut. This wasn't a kid who'd been cared for. This was a kid who'd been protecting something fragile for too long. "Do you ever get tired?" Kevin asked, not looking at him. Lucas hesitated, then answered quietly, "Only when she cries and pretends she's not." Kevin nodded, absorbing the weight of that answer, more honest than any adult had spoken to him in years. Before he could say anything else, Rachel's voice came from the other room. "You boys all right in there?" Lucas looked at him. "She always asks that when she needs to sit down, but doesn't want me to worry." They walked back to the living room together. Rachel was on the couch now, blanket around her shoulders, a cup of tea steaming untouched on the table. Kevin sat across from her. Lucas curled up in the armchair nearby, drawing silently. For a long moment, Rachel and Kevin just looked at each other. Then she spoke. "I didn't want this," she said. "Any of it. The sickness, the distance, you." Her voice cracked faintly. "But I had to make choices, and I was scared you'd hate me." Kevin inhaled, steady but slow. "I thought you left because of what happened. Because of ... Susan." Rachel shook her head. "No. I left because you stopped looking at me like I was real, like I mattered. You buried yourself in business and logic. I didn't know how to reach you anymore." Kevin lowered his gaze. "And Lucas?" She nodded. "I found out 2 months after you left. They told me what you'd been told, that you couldn't be a father, and I believed them too, but I couldn't undo it. I thought maybe it was a miracle or a mistake. I didn't care. He was mine." She looked over at Lucas. "He was mine, and now he can't just be mine anymore." Her voice faltered, but she didn't cry. "He needs someone," she said, barely above a whisper, "when I'm gone. Someone who doesn't just see him as a responsibility or a favor to a dying woman. Someone who'll see him the way he deserves." Kevin didn't speak. He couldn't. The words pressed against his throat, thick and unfinished. Because in that moment he didn't know if he was the man she wanted him to be or if he had ever been. But Lucas sat nearby, legs curled under him, scribbling in a notebook like the conversation wasn't his, even though every word was. Rachel looked at Kevin one last time, her gaze clearer than it had been in years. "You don't have to promise anything now," she said. But if there's even a piece of you that still believes in the man I once knew, don't leave him alone." Kevin's eyes finally met hers, and for the first time since he walked in, he didn't feel like a stranger. But still, he said nothing. As they sat in silence, Lucas's quiet humming filled the room. Rachel leaned back, her hands trembling faintly. And Kevin realized he hadn't stepped into an old chapter. He had stepped into an ending, one that left him speechless. One where, for the first time in years, he didn't know how to respond. The envelope came with no ceremony, just slid across Kevin's polished desk like any other document, but everything in him stilled the moment he saw it. The return address was the lab-neutral font, clinical paper. He held it longer than necessary before opening it, fingers stiff. And for a second he thought about not reading it, about pretending it had gotten lost or delayed, but that would only buy time he didn't know what to do with. He unfolded the paper and scanned the lines, searching for some hint of ambiguity. But it was plain. Negative. No biological match. Lucas wasn't his son. Not biologically. The words stared back at him, black and final. His body reacted before his mind did, stomach tightening, ears ringing. The memory of Lucas's laugh, Rachel's voice breaking when she said his name. The careful way the boy folded napkins into planes. All of it collided with the sterile conclusion of the document in his hand. He dropped it on the desk as if it burned. He wasn't angry. Not yet. He was severed from whatever he'd begun to allow himself to believe, as if the door that had opened just a sliver had now been slammed shut by science itself. He didn't call. He drove. Straight to the apartment without telling anyone, his grip on the steering wheel white-knuckled. By the time Rachel opened the door, his expression said everything. She stepped back instinctively. "Kevin?" she asked, voice unsure. He walked in without waiting. "It's negative," he said, holding out the paper. "The test. It says he's not mine." Rachel's face drained of color as she took the envelope, her hands shaking. She opened it slowly, eyes darting across the page, trying to make sense of the lines. "That can't be right," she murmured, more to herself than to him. "I don't understand. That's not possible." Kevin's voice was low but sharp. "Then explain it to me. Because I'm holding proof that everything you said, every look, every word was based on something that isn't true." Rachel's voice cracked. "Kevin, I swear to you, I never lied. I never even thought to doubt. He's yours. I know it." She looked up at him, desperation clear in her eyes. "I wasn't with anyone else. Not then. Not ever." But Kevin's jaw was tight, his posture unyielding. "Then how do you explain this?" he asked, gesturing toward the paper like it was a verdict. Rachel sat down slowly, legs buckling beneath her. "I don't know," she whispered, "but I didn't fake anything. I wouldn't do that to you. Or to him." Kevin paced the small living room, hands clenched at his sides. "Then someone did," he said. "Because this?" He held up the paper again. "This tells me I've been played. Again." Rachel's face crumpled. "Kevin, look at me," she said, reaching out weakly. "Please, I didn't do this." But he was already pulling away, too far into the storm inside him to hear the plea. "You know what this feels like?" he said bitterly. "It feels like all those years ago, all over again. When you disappeared. When I was left with nothing but doubt and silence." Her voice was thin now. "I didn't want you to go through this. I didn't think you ever would. I thought, if there was any chance for him to have you, I had to try." Kevin stared at her. "Well, he won't. Not if it's all a lie." And even as he said it, something in his chest twisted, not with anger, but with disappointment too heavy to hold. Through the paper-thin walls, Lucas had heard everything. He sat on the floor of his room, legs crossed, a sheet of paper in his lap. He didn't cry, not loudly, just stared down at his newest drawing, unfinished, a rocket ship half-colored. He tore a corner from it quietly, folding it into a triangle, then into wings. His fingers moved automatically. It was how he protected himself, by making something that could fly away. This time, before creasing the final fold, he wrote one word on the wing in small, careful letters: "Kevin." He looked at it for a moment, then stood and moved to the window. Through the gap in the curtain, he saw Kevin in the parking lot, already halfway to his car. Lucas pressed his fingers to the glass, the little plane in his hand. "Are you coming back?" he asked quietly, not even sure Kevin could hear him. His voice barely carried beyond the glass. "You forgot your plane." But Kevin didn't look back, didn't stop. The car door slammed, engine starting with a burst of sound that cut through the quiet like a final answer. Back inside, Rachel remained motionless on the couch, the letter trembling in her lap, her shoulders hunched as though the weight of the truth or the lie was too much to bear. She didn't chase after him. She didn't try to call him back. Some moments demanded silence, even if it killed you. Lucas returned to his spot on the floor and placed the paper plane on his windowsill like a message waiting to be claimed. He didn't understand all of it, but he understood enough. Something had broken. Something bigger than promises. Bigger than names on test results. And as much as he wanted to believe Kevin would come back, part of him already knew things that fly away don't always return. Downstairs, the sound of the car fading into distance echoed like a clock striking the wrong hour. Rachel finally turned her head toward Lucas's door, her voice hoarse. "I didn't lie," she said, not sure if she was speaking to him or herself. "I swear to God I didn't," but no answer came. Kevin was gone, and all that remained was a plane with his name on it, balanced on the edge of the world. Kevin drove without a destination, the letter still on the seat beside him, but it may as well have been a wall. The result had landed like a gavel, yet he couldn't stop seeing Lucas's face, hearing Rachel's voice, feeling the weight of something that didn't match the cold clarity of a lab report. But none of that mattered now, not to him, not after years of betrayal, manipulation, and carefully constructed defenses. He had walked into this with an open wound that dared to hope, and now it stung like it had always been bleeding. Still, something about Rachel's devastation hadn't felt like performance. And something about the boy, his stillness, his quiet longing, his folded planes clung to Kevin's mind like unfinished questions. But he pushed it all aside, pushed it down. As far as he was concerned, the facts were facts. And facts didn't feel. Facts ended things. The moment he turned out of the apartment complex, ignoring Lucas's small voice behind the window, asking if he would come back, Kevin Barton ceased to be whatever he had started to become. The storm inside him had no room for maybes. Not anymore. Kevin was halfway through his second glass of scotch when his phone vibrated on the counter. He ignored it at first, his mind still tangled in the wreckage of the day. But it buzzed again, persistent, soft, like a whisper he couldn't silence. Finally, he picked it up. One message, one line. From an unknown number, though. He didn't need a contact name to know who had sent it. "Did I do something wrong? Mommy is crying." For a moment, he couldn't move. The glass in his hand felt irrelevant, the room around him distant. The words were simple, unpolished, but they struck deep, slicing through his anger and confusion like a scalpel. The thought of Lucas alone in that too-clean room, believing he was to blame for something far beyond his comprehension, filled Kevin with something he didn't recognize, something that looked a lot like shame. He tried to tell himself this wasn't his fault, that the boy wasn't his responsibility. But the words clung to him. "Mommy is crying." He stared at the message until the screen dimmed, and even then the words echoed in his mind. Somewhere in the dark, a child was waiting for an answer, and Kevin had none. He was still sitting there, phone untouched, when it rang again, this time a call. He nearly let it go to voicemail until the name flashed across the screen. Dr. Benjamin Harrison. Kevin answered without thinking. "Harrison," he said, voice low and rough. "Kevin," came the familiar voice, calm but serious. "I wasn't sure if I should call, but I thought you'd want to know. Something's off." Kevin straightened. "What do you mean?" Harrison hesitated, then continued. "Earlier today I got a call from the lab that ran your paternity test. They said someone identifying as your legal counsel contacted them, asking for confirmation of the sample results. The thing is, they said her name was Susan Osborne." Kevin's stomach dropped. "Susan?" he repeated. "Are you sure?" Harrison sighed. "I've known you a long time. I know Susan too. She was asking questions. The ones about the chain of custody. About sample storage. It set off red flags." Kevin stood slowly, the scotch forgotten, replaced by a rising tension in his chest. "She told me not to believe it," he muttered, thinking aloud. "The moment the letter showed up, she dismissed everything, said I was chasing ghosts." Harrison was quiet. "Kevin, I don't want to speculate, but if you have doubts about the integrity of the results, you should act on them, fast." Kevin ended the call with a tight thank you and lowered the phone. His mind reeled, not just from what Harrison had said, but from the flood of memories that followed. Susan at the office, her sharp pivot from concern to control, her calculated dismissal of Rachel's letter, her insistence that Kevin couldn't be the father based on an old diagnosis he'd never re-examined. How had he not seen it before? Not questioned the ease with which she'd accepted the results, the way she'd subtly guided him away from Rachel, from Lucas, from the truth. It was all starting to click into place now, not with the clarity of evidence, but with the precision of instinct. And the more he reviewed it, the more it sickened him. Susan had always been near the pain, never in it, but close enough to steer it. He pulled up the lab's number and dialed without hesitation. A woman answered, and he introduced himself briskly. I need to verify whether anyone accessed or inquired about my paternity test. I believe there may have been a breach." The woman hesitated. "Sir, I'll need to check with our supervisor." "Do it," Kevin snapped, "and call me back tonight." He hung up before she could respond. He sank into the couch, not because he was tired, but because he needed to sit still or risk breaking something. His thoughts churned. Rachel's face came back to him, not during their fight, but earlier when she'd said she hadn't lied. When she looked him in the eye and told him Lucas was his. He hadn't wanted to believe her then, not because she wasn't convincing, but because the pain of hope was worse than certainty. But now, armed with Harrison's call and the gnawing weight of suspicion, Kevin found himself considering something else, something terrifying. What if Rachel had told the truth all along? What if Lucas really was his son and he'd walked away because of a lie someone else orchestrated? The guilt was immediate, clenching in his chest like a vice. He pictured Lucas's quiet eyes, his careful voice, the paper plane with Kevin written on it. That child had trusted him on instinct alone. And Kevin had shattered it with the force of an adult's doubt. "God," he whispered, scrubbing a hand down his face. "What the hell have I done?" His phone buzzed again, another message. This time from Harrison. "Call me when you can, there's more." Kevin didn't wait. He called back instantly. Harrison picked up. "Kevin, I just got off the phone with a tech at the lab. There's no legal reason Susan Osborne should have had access to your file, but she did. She used your executive clearance. The system log shows she accessed the records 2 hours before the results were finalized. And there's a flagged discrepancy, a delay between sample analysis and report generation. I don't know what it means yet, but it's not standard." Kevin's pulse thundered in his ears. "So it's possible the test was tampered with?" Harrison didn't say yes, but he didn't say no. "Get a second opinion. Somewhere Susan has no reach." Kevin nodded, even though the call was audio only. "I will." When the call ended, Kevin sat motionless. Then he stood, grabbed his keys, and walked out the door, not to Rachel's. Not yet, but toward the one thing he could still control, the truth. And so in the middle of that long, aching night, after a child's text and a doctor's warning, Kevin Barton sat in his car with his hands on the wheel, staring out at a city that felt less real than it had hours before. Every wall he'd built was starting to crack, not because of emotion, but because of something colder. Evidence. Pieces falling into place. Motives. Timelines. Lies. Susan. Her rehearsed words. Her eager control. Her timing. And for the first time, Kevin allowed the unthinkable to solidify into possibility. The test had been manipulated. Everything, his distance from Lucas, his anger at Rachel, his choice to walk away, had been built on a foundation someone else had quietly poised. And now he would find out how deep it went. Kevin didn't hesitate. The morning after Harrison's call, he set the entire process in motion. He reached out to a private lab in Boston, one he trusted, one Susan Osborne couldn't touch. He requested absolute discretion, no email trails, no digital confirmations, everything handled by phone and in person. He brought his own sample, hand-delivered it, and made arrangements for a technician to personally retrieve a swab from Lucas. No third parties, no room for manipulation. The lab would cross-check every step against chain-of-custody documentation overseen by a forensic specialist. This wasn't about suspicion anymore, it was about certainty. Kevin needed the truth, yes, but more than that, he needed control. Not over Rachel, not over the boy, over the narrative that had nearly broken him. This time there would be no Susan, no easy interference, no assumptions. He didn't tell Rachel, he didn't even tell Harrison. And when he looked at himself in the mirror that morning, he didn't recognize the man staring back. He wasn't the one who had walked away with cold finality. He was someone different now, someone moving not from pain, but from purpose. When he arrived at the apartment, Rachel's reaction was restrained. She let him in without a word, but she didn't meet his eyes. Her posture was stiff, her voice clipped. "Lucas is in his room," she said simply, and walked back to the kitchen. Kevin followed her halfway, then stopped, unsure how to begin. "I just wanted to see him," he said finally. "I won't stay long." Rachel didn't respond right away. She was folding a dish towel over the handle of the oven, too focused on something that didn't need focus. "It's been a hard week," she said eventually. "He's been asking why you left so fast, why you didn't say goodbye." Kevin nodded, guilt swelling again, but this time he didn't try to defend himself. "I didn't know what to say," he admitted. "I still don't, but I'm here." That last sentence lingered between them. Rachel turned slowly, and for a moment Kevin thought she might cry. But instead she nodded. "Then go see him." Lucas was sitting on the floor, knees pulled up to his chest, a half-finished Lego structure in front of him. When he saw Kevin, his face lit up, just a little, but he didn't jump to his feet like last time. Kevin approached slowly, crouching beside him. "Hey buddy," he said gently. "Working on something big?" Lucas shrugged. "It was a spaceship, then it wasn't." Kevin smiled faintly. "That happens sometimes. Things change halfway through." Lucas didn't say anything, but he pushed the pieces toward Kevin, inviting him in silently. They worked side by side for several minutes, not needing to fill the air with words. Eventually, Kevin glanced at the hallway. "Your mom okay?" Lucas looked up. "She's tired a lot." Kevin nodded. "I know. She's fighting really hard." Lucas paused. "They fight hard?" The question caught Kevin off guard. He nodded again, slower this time. "I'm learning to." Lucas gave a small, thoughtful nod, as if that answer satisfied something in him. Then he reached into his pocket, hesitated, and pulled out a folded piece of paper. Kevin recognized it immediately, not from sight, but from the way Lucas held it, like it mattered. He took it carefully, unfolded it, and read the words written in pencil, block letters with a few backwards ones. "I wish you were my dad." He didn't breathe for a second. Rachel's quiet footsteps echoed in the hallway behind them, but she didn't speak. She was watching. Kevin swallowed hard, then looked at Lucas. "Did you mean this?" he asked softly. Lucas gave the smallest of nods. Kevin's voice cracked. "Can I keep it?" The boy nodded again. "It's already yours." That sentence unraveled something in Kevin, something deep. He reached out and touched Lucas's shoulder, not with authority, but with something gentler. "Thank you," he whispered. "I'll keep it safe." Lucas looked down, smiling without showing teeth. For the first time since that day in the lobby, there was no awkwardness, no hesitation, just presence. Later, as Rachel stood by the couch folding a blanket, Kevin crossed the room to help her. She resisted at first, only out of habit, but let him take it. Their fingers brushed. She glanced at him, eyes softening. "You didn't have to come," she said. "I know," he replied, "but I wanted to." Her expression changed, then less guarded, less proud. She exhaled, and in that breath something unspoken passed between them. Not resolution, not forgiveness, but understanding. Rachel turned her face away quickly, brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear, but not before Kevin saw the faint wetness in her eyes. He didn't comment on it. He just handed her the blanket and said, "I'll see you both soon." As he turned to leave, he slipped the folded note into his jacket pocket, his hand lingering over it like a promise. He didn't need to say anything else. The words had already been given to him. "It's already yours." The call came just before noon, but Kevin had been pacing since sunrise. His phone rang with a sterile tone, but his heart responded like a drum. He answered before the first ring finished. The voice on the other end was calm, clinical. "Mr. Barton, the paternity test results are in. Would you like me to review them with you now?" He said yes, but his throat tightened so violently it barely came out. "The results confirm with 99.98% certainty that Lucas Cromwell is your biological son." The words landed like a wave, not violent but absolute. Kevin sat down slowly, hand trembling as he placed the phone on the table. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of memories, of the paper plane, of Rachel's voice trembling when she said she hadn't lied, of Lucas's quiet eyes, of everything he had nearly let slip through his fingers. And then he stood, grabbed his keys without a second thought, and walked to his car. The city outside blurred as he drove, every red light a challenge to his patience. The only thought anchoring him was one that repeated over and over like a drumbeat. "He's mine." Rachel was seated at the kitchen table when the knock came. She didn't move right away, maybe because her body couldn't, or maybe because her heart was already racing. Something about the rhythm of that knock, quick, urgent, familiar, made her stand slowly, gripping the chair for balance. When she opened the door, Kevin stood there with a look she hadn't seen in years. Not pride, not pain, but certainty. Her eyes filled before he even spoke. "It's true," he said, voice thick. "Lucas is mine." She broke. Not in anger, not in fear, she just collapsed into his chest. The weight of so many days spent, doubted, dismissed, and alone, giving way to a sob that had waited too long. Kevin held her, arms tight around her back, not trying to hush her, not trying to explain. Just there, present. The way he should have been. When she finally stepped back, her face was streaked with tears, but her eyes were clear. "You believe me?" she whispered. Kevin nodded. "I believe you now. And I'm sorry I didn't when it mattered most." Her lips trembled, but she didn't speak again. She only stepped aside, and Kevin walked in, no longer a visitor, but something more. Lucas peeked from the hallway, holding the same drawing Kevin had folded into his pocket days ago. This time he didn't hide it. He just stood there, staring with those wide, unreadable eyes that always seemed older than his years. Kevin approached slowly, lowering himself to his knees. He said gently, "I have something to tell you." Lucas tilted his head, silent. Kevin reached into his coat and pulled out the test result envelope. "I did another test. A real one. No one changed it. No one touched it. It told me what I think we both knew." He paused, letting the weight of the moment carry itself. "I'm your dad, Lucas." The boy didn't cry. He didn't run. He simply nodded, just once, as if the world had righted itself in a way he'd been waiting for. "I knew," he said softly. "Mom said I looked like you." Kevin laughed, a cracked, surprised laugh that held more love than humor. "You do," he agreed. "But even if you didn't, I think I would have known anyway." Lucas stepped forward and placed his small hand on Kevin's shoulder. "Are you staying this time?" Kevin nodded, voice too thick to speak. Lucas didn't ask again. Later that night, after dinner and after Rachel had gently insisted on washing the dishes herself despite Kevin's protests, he found Lucas already curled up on the couch, a stack of books beside him. "Can you read one?" the boy asked, as if unsure he was allowed to. Kevin smiled, sat beside him, and picked one at random. "Of course," he said, cracking open the worn spine. His voice faltered slightly on the first page, but soon he found his rhythm. Lucas leaned against him, silent, eyes tracking the words like they held secrets. Rachel stood in the hallway out of sight, listening. Kevin read slowly, with Keir not just telling a story, but giving something. By the time he reached the last page, Lucas had stopped responding. His breath had evened out, and his small fingers were curled tightly around Kevin's hand. Kevin didn't move. He looked down at the boy, the son he had doubted, the son he had found, and stayed still. Rachel finally stepped into view, holding a cup of tea she hadn't touched. She didn't say anything. She just sat on the armrest nearby, watching them. Her face held no bitterness, only exhaustion and hope, and something softer than either. She hadn't imagined this moment could feel this quiet. She expected more words, more apologies, more explanations. But watching Kevin there, with Lucas asleep against him and that test result still folded in his jacket pocket, she understood that some truths don't need to be spoken, they just need to be lived. She leaned back, letting herself breathe for the first time in what felt like weeks. Not fully, not freely, but enough. Enough to hope. And so, with the truth finally laid bare and the air between them cleared of all pretense, Kevin sat there long after the story had ended, his hand still in Lucas's, as if afraid to let go. Rachel didn't ask him to. She didn't need to. In that quiet room, the three of them existed not in grief or guilt, but in something new, something tentative but real. And for the first time, Kevin understood what it meant to belong. Lucas's fingers twitched in sleep, still clutching his, and Kevin didn't move. Because tonight, finally, he wasn't running. He was home. 3 weeks passed, not in a blur, but in moments that carried weight. Rachel's body, once weakened by disease and despair, began to respond to the treatment Kevin insisted on financing without condition. The shifts were subtle at first. She could stand longer, laugh without coughing, eat without wincing, but they were victories all the same. The shadows under her eyes lightened. Her voice steadied. Her gaze no longer drifted toward the future with dread, but with cautious expectation. Kevin showed up every morning, not just to drive them to appointments or cover medical costs, but to be present in the full sense of the word. He brought her meals, adjusted her pillows, watched movies beside her without speaking, just to make sure she wasn't alone. And Lucas, always watching, took notice. The man who once barely acknowledged his existence now built pillow forts with him, learned the names of his stuffed animals, and sat through entire episodes of cartoons with mock-serious analysis. Kevin, for the first time in decades, was no longer measuring time by deadlines or earnings. He was measuring it by how many minutes it took to make Rachel smile, and how often Lucas reached for his hand without hesitation. One of Kevin's first major decisions came without ceremony. He let go of Susan. The conversation had been colder than expected, not explosive, but final. She had known it was coming, perhaps even before he did. "You were never going to choose me," she'd said bitterly, her mask finally slipping. Not once he appeared. Kevin didn't argue. He just nodded and left. There was no catharsis in the ending, only the clarity that it needed to end. With her gone, Kevin took the next step without looking back. He hired a full-time caregiver for Rachel, someone warm and discreet, someone who understood how to help without hovering. He also began transforming his home. The guest room became Lucas's room, walls painted with his favorite colors, shelves lined with books and toys he picked himself. Kevin even placed Rachel's lavender-scented candles on the kitchen counter. A small, unspoken tribute to the years lost and slowly being rebuilt. It was a home now, not the cold, sterile space it had once been. And the man walking through its hallways each morning was no longer a stranger to himself. Lucas had taken to taping drawings to the living room window of the apartment. The first one had been a wobbly version of Kevin holding hands with Rachel and Lucas beneath a crooked rainbow. Kevin had smiled when he saw it, but said nothing, just knelt to hug the boy tightly. As the weeks passed, new drawings joined the old one, creating a mosaic of simple joys, stick figure birthdays, ice cream cones, a dog they didn't own but dreamed about. Rachel would sometimes stand behind him, arms wrapped around her fragile frame, and say quietly, "He draws what he wants to remember." Kevin understood. The pictures weren't just art, they were proof. Proof of presence. Proof of moments that had happened, no matter how fleeting. And as Lucas added more paper to the glass, he did so with care, like he was creating stained glass out of hope. Sometimes Kevin caught Rachel watching him tape them up, her eyes shimmering. Neither of them spoke of the deeper meaning. They didn't need to. They had lived too long in silence to not recognize the language of gestures. On a quiet Tuesday evening, Kevin cooked dinner himself, burnt the rice, over-seasoned the chicken, but Rachel and Lucas ate every bite like it was from a five-star restaurant. After the dishes were cleared, Kevin lingered in the kitchen, fiddling with something in his pocket. Rachel sat at the table, sipping tea, while Lucas colored at the floor nearby, humming softly. Kevin cleared his throat once, then again. Rachel turned to him with a curious smile, but it faded as she saw his expression, serious, almost reverent. He walked around the counter and stopped in front of her, then knelt. Lucas looked up immediately, sensing something important. Kevin pulled a small box from his pocket and opened it with a nervous breath. "Rachel Cromwell," he said, voice low and steady, "will you marry me?" Her eyes widened, hands trembling slightly, but he wasn't finished. He turned his head toward Lucas, and Lucas, he added, "Will you let me be your dad forever?" The boy blinked once, then stood and walked away without a word. Kevin's heart stuttered in panic, but he remained kneeling. Rachel looked just as confused, ready to call after her son. When Lucas returned, this time holding a freshly drawn picture in both hands, he didn't say anything. He just handed it to Kevin. 3 figures stood in a row holding hands beneath a large sun, with a ring drawn in gold crayon floating above them like a crown. The word "yes" was scribbled in uneven letters underneath. Kevin swallowed hard, gripping the picture as if it were made of glass. He looked at Rachel, who was now openly crying, and then at Lucas. "I'll frame this," Kevin said, voice cracking. "First thing tomorrow." Lucas nodded. Rachel reached out, cupped Kevin's cheek with a shaking hand, and said, "Then I guess you have your answer." Kevin slipped the ring onto her finger as if sealing a chapter that had waited too long to be written. That night, long after Lucas had fallen asleep and Rachel had dozed off on the couch with her hand still in Kevin's, Kevin sat alone in front of the window. He looked at the newest drawing taped there, this one slightly crooked but unmistakably hopeful. He touched the glass gently, his reflection merging with the crayon sun behind it. It didn't feel like an ending. It felt like the middle of something finally real. Kevin stayed there for a long while, not because he didn't want to move, but because he didn't need to. Behind him, the woman he loved was healing. In the next room, the boy who had once appeared as a stranger was now his son. And on the window, in colors that refused to fade, their future stared back at him, drawn by the only hand that had ever truly believed he belonged. Winter faded into spring like a breath being released after a long, painful hold. The weeks had passed not just with medical milestones, but with small, hard-earned victories that layered themselves quietly into the fabric of daily life. Rachel's remission deepened, not just in scans and test results, but in the way she began humming again while stirring her tea, or how she danced a little in the kitchen when she thought no one was watching. Lucas had adjusted to his new school, even if it took a few rocky starts and days when Kevin had to sit outside the building just to make sure he felt safe. Each evening, without fail, Kevin tucked him in, listening to his rambles about fractions and classmates and how he wanted to be an inventor when he grew up. Sometimes Rachel would join them, curled at the edge of the bed, listening to both of them like she was memorizing the sound of this life they had built, because in some ways she was. After years of silence, betrayal, and distance, they now breathed in unison. And every time Kevin closed the door to Lucas's room at night, he paused just for a second to take it all in. The penthouse had changed too. Gone were the minimalist lines and sterile surfaces that once reflected Kevin's need for control and emotional distance. The space now pulsed with color and warmth. Crayon drawings covered the fridge like trophies, some crooked, others boldly signed with Lucas Barton in shaky letters. One hallway had been unofficially claimed as the family's art gallery, with every new drawing of a rocket ship, a monster, or their family framed and mounted with pride. Rachel had insisted on keeping her old coffee mugs, chipped edges and all, and Kevin found that he liked the contrast they brought. Music, once an afterthought, now filled the space. Classical on lazy mornings, soul on rainy afternoons, and Lucas's favorite cartoon theme songs echoing down the halls on weekends. There were disagreements too, of course. Rachel argued about over-salting pasta. Lucas once cried because Kevin folded his paper dragon wrong, and Kevin still sometimes worked too late. But none of those moments stuck. What lingered instead were the quiet reconciliations, the laughter under shared blankets, and the unspoken understanding that none of them took this for granted. One rainy Thursday afternoon, while Lucas was sprawled on the living room floor building his 5th paper plane of the day, Kevin rummaged through an old drawer he hadn't opened in years. He hadn't been looking for anything in particular, just chasing a moment of quiet curiosity, but what he found pulled him still. A photograph, slightly faded, with edges curled and color softened by time. Rachel, 20-something, in a sundress, laughing mid-turn, her hair caught in the wind. She was holding a sunflower and her eyes were squinting against the sun. Kevin stared at it for a long time. Not because she looked different, she didn't, not in any meaningful way, but because even back then, her smile held the same stubborn joy she carried now. He rose from the drawer and walked to where she sat curled on the couch, half reading, half watching their son. Without a word, he showed her the picture. She took it delicately, fingers brushing his, then looked up at him. "God," she whispered. "I'd forgotten about this day." Kevin didn't speak. He simply leaned down, pressed his lips to her temple, and sat beside her, their shoulders touching. Outside, the rain streaked down the windows, but inside there was only warmth. Lucas, unaware of the gravity hanging between his parents, continued folding his paper plane with intense focus. This one was different, longer wings, stronger folds. Kevin watched from the couch, tilting his head as he noticed something written on the paper before Lucas pinched the nose to seal it shut. "What did you write?" Kevin asked, gentle curiosity in his tone. Lucas shrugged. "You'll see." He stood up, feet bare on the hardwood floor, and held the plane delicately in both hands. Rachel shifted beside Kevin, her eyes following their son like she already knew this moment would matter. Lucas took a few steps back, narrowed his eyes toward the far end of the living room, and then launched the plane with a graceful flick of his wrist. It soared, not like the shaky ones he used to make when he was alone, but smooth and steady, cutting through the air like it belonged there. It landed gently near Kevin's feet. He reached down to pick it up, unfolding the wing carefully. 3 names were written inside: Kevin, Rachel, Lucas. No titles, no labels, just names. Equal, unified. Rachel leaned in, resting her head against Kevin's shoulder, her fingers lacing with his without needing to be asked. "He always writes our names like that," she murmured. "No last names, no mom or dad, just us." Kevin looked down at the plane again, then at his son, who was now grinning as he began folding another. "Maybe that's all a family is," Kevin said softly. "Names you choose to write beside yours." Rachel closed her eyes, letting the truth of that settle between them. Lucas grabbed a new sheet of paper, clearly intent on building a fleet. Kevin laughed quietly. "You planning to escape?" he teased. Lucas shook his head, voice confident. "No, I'm planning to stay." The simplicity of the answer took Kevin's breath away. And when the next plane lifted from Lucas's hands and glided across the living room, it didn't carry the weight of a boy trying to flee a life too heavy to hold. It didn't seek open windows or distant winds. It wasn't about escaping. It was about anchoring. That paper plane, with all 3 of their names inked into its wings, sailed forward and landed softly, not in fear, not in doubt, but in belonging. And for once, none of them reached to retrieve it. It had landed exactly where it was meant to be. Home. This story touched us deeply while we were creating it, and we truly hope it meant something to you too. Here on Stories That Stay, we pour care and time into every video. Some take over a week to craft because we believe you deserve stories that speak to the heart. If you felt moved, consider subscribing to our channel. It's the best way to help us keep bringing you moments like these. And don't forget to explore our other videos. We'd love to hear what touched you the most in the comments below. Your words inspire us more than you can imagine. Thank you for being here, and until next time.